In 72 hours, 4 astronauts will leave the only protective magnetic field any human being has ever known. The last time we tried this, the sun fired a radiation storm capable of killing everyone aboard, and missed by months. Not by design. By accident. Now, during the most active solar period in decades, with unstable sunspot regions already flaring and a geomagnetic storm watch issued for the day before launch, NASA is sending Artemis 2 toward the moon anyway. The spacecraft has shielding. It has protocols. What it does not have is a way home fast enough to matter. Stay until the end. Because tonight we ask the quiet question the launch coverage is not asking. Hit subscribe and stay close, because this mission is still counting down. The solar data is still coming in. The active regions are still evolving. When something significant develops before or during that launch window, this channel is where you will hear it first. You will want to be here for that. Now, let us get into it. In 72 hours, 4 human beings will sit on top of 8.8 million pounds of thrust and attempt something no person on Earth has done in 53 years. They will leave. Not just leave Earth. Not just leave the atmosphere. They will leave the protective bubble that has kept every living thing on this planet alive for 4 billion years. The magnetic cocoon we call the magnetosphere. And they will travel to the moon. 2 million kilometers of open space. No atmosphere. No magnetic field. No shelter except what they brought with them. The mission is called Artemis 2, and it is scheduled to launch in early April 2026 from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The crew is 4 people: Reed Wiseman, the mission commander, Victor Glover, the pilot, Christina Koch, the mission specialist, and Jeremy Hansen, representing the Canadian Space Agency. This crew carries more historic weight than almost any mission in NASA's history. Christina Koch will become the first woman to travel to lunar distance. Victor Glover will be the first black astronaut to do the same. Jeremy Hansen will be the first Canadian to leave low Earth orbit. The milestone language writes itself, and the media has written it, repeatedly, enthusiastically, and almost exclusively. Here is what the media has not written quite so enthusiastically. Artemis 2 is launching during the maximum phase of Solar Cycle 25. The Sun right now is at or near the peak of its roughly 11-year cycle of activity. Sunspot numbers are elevated. Flare frequency is elevated. The probability of significant solar energetic particle events, the kind that can deliver dangerous radiation doses to unshielded humans in deep space, is as high as it gets in any given 11-year window. And it gets more specific than that. As of this recording, there are 11 active solar regions on the face of the Sun. 2 of them, designated Active Region 4401 and Active Region 4405, carry what scientists classify as beta-gamma magnetic field configurations. That classification is not a technicality. Beta-gamma means the magnetic fields in those regions are complex, tangled, and unstable. It means they are the kind of regions that produce significant flares without much warning. In the past several days alone, both regions have produced multiple M-class flares, and at least one event reached M3.9, a level that starts to attract serious attention from space weather forecasters. Then, there is this. The Space Weather Prediction Center issued a G1 geomagnetic storm watch for March 30th, 2026. The day before the launch window opens. That is not a coincidence worth ignoring. That is the Sun, essentially knocking on the door the day before 4 humans plan to walk through it. Now, to be clear, a G1 storm is the lowest level on the 5-point geomagnetic storm scale. It is not catastrophic. It is not a crisis. Satellites remain functional, power grids are not threatened, and your GPS will probably still work. But a G1 watch does not exist in isolation. It exists as a signal that solar activity is elevated, that the interplanetary magnetic field is behaving in ways that increase storm coupling, and that the sun is, right now, doing things worth watching very carefully. And here's the part that nobody seems to be saying out loud. This launch is happening anyway. The historic framing, the crew bios, the countdown graphics, all of it is running at full volume. The solar conditions are mentioned, if at all, in the 40-second version of a news segment before they move on to the launch cam footage. But before you decide whether that bothers you, there is something else you need to know. Something that happened in 1972. Something that should have changed how we think about deep space missions forever. And in some ways, it did. But in other ways, the ways that count, it quietly got filed away under close call and left there. In August of 1972, the sun did something extraordinary. It fired one of the most intense solar particle events ever recorded in the modern era of space observation. A massive flare erupted, driving a storm of high-energy protons across the inner solar system at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The event arrived at Earth's orbit within hours, not days, hours, and the radiation levels it delivered were not the kind you shake off. Post-event analysis by NASA scientists estimated that an astronaut caught in open space during that storm, outside the protection of a spacecraft or the Earth's magnetosphere, could have received a radiation dose capable of causing acute radiation syndrome. In extreme cases, the dose models suggest it could have been lethal. Pause on that for a moment. 1972. The Apollo program was still running. NASA was sending humans to the moon on a regular basis. By the standards of the time, it had almost become routine. Apollo 16 had returned from the moon in April of 1972. Apollo 17, the last crewed lunar mission in history, launched in December of 1972. The August event fell exactly between them. Not during a mission. Between missions. The timing saved those astronauts' lives, and it had nothing to do with technology. This is worth sitting with. We talk about the Apollo program as a triumph of engineering and human ingenuity, and it was. But it was also, in at least one critical sense, extraordinarily lucky. The Apollo spacecraft offered minimal radiation shielding compared to what we have today. There was no storm shelter protocol. There were no astro-rad vests. The dosimetry was primitive by modern standards. If a crew had been in transit 3 or 4 days from Earth, halfway to the moon, during the August 1972 event, the outcome could have been very different from the one we celebrate. NASA scientists knew this. Post-mission analyses documented it. The 1972 event became a reference point in radiation safety planning for decades. It is cited in academic papers. It is referenced in mission planning documents. It is, in the world of space weather research, well known. Outside that world, it is almost unknown. And here is the uncomfortable implication hiding underneath that history. Humanity's record of sending humans to the moon without a single major radiation incident is not purely a record of good planning. It is partly a record of good timing. We went to the moon 12 times across 6 missions, and not once did a crew encounter a solar particle event during transit. The odds were not impossible. Solar maximum conditions during some Apollo missions were not as active as what we are seeing now, but they were not nothing either. We were lucky. And now, 53 years later, we are going back, during a more active solar cycle than most of the Apollo era, with a crew that includes historic firsts that the entire world is watching. So the question worth asking, the one that seems to be getting drowned out by the countdown music, is this: what exactly has changed? And is it enough? Right now, the sun has 11 active regions on its visible face, and 2 of them are behaving in ways that demand attention. Active Region 4401 and Active Region 4405 are both classified as beta-gamma magnetic configurations. If you are not a solar physicist, and most of us are not, here is what that means in plain language. Solar active regions are areas of intense magnetic activity on the sun's surface. Scientists classify them based on the complexity of their magnetic field structure, using a letter-based scheme called the Mount Wilson classification. A simple region with a single polarity is an alpha region. A region with both positive and negative polarity, but clear separation between them, is a beta region. When you get to beta gamma, you have a region where the polarities are mixed together in complex, tangled patterns that make the magnetic configuration inherently unstable. Think of it like a rubber band wound too tight. The question is not whether it will snap, it is when. Beta-gamma regions are the ones that produce significant flares. Both regions currently qualify. In the past several days, the activity log reads like a slow escalation. Multiple C-class flares. Think of those as the baseline, the everyday background noise of solar activity. Multiple M-class events, including an M1.3 and an M3.9. The Space Weather Prediction Center has the probability of further M-class flares at 50% for the current active regions. The probability of stronger activity, X-class territory, sits around 10%. Now, 10% sounds modest. We will come back to why it is not later. But for now, set aside the flare probabilities and look at something else. For more than 7 consecutive days, the electron flux in the space environment around Earth has been elevated above 1,000 particle flux units. The peak hit approximately 12,785 particle flux units. That is not just a spike. That is a sustained, prolonged period of elevated space environment activity. Electrons at these levels are not directly dangerous to humans in spacecraft the way high-energy protons are, but they are a meaningful signal. They tell you the sun has been pushing elevated energy into the solar system for an extended period. They tell you the environment is not calm. Here is the critical distinction that matters most right now. The proton flux, the component that is actually dangerous to human health in deep space, is currently low. That is the honest, factual answer to the question of whether Artemis 2 faces an immediate radiation threat on launch day. Right now, it does not. Proton levels are within acceptable parameters. But the danger here is not what is happening at this exact moment. The danger is the environment that has been established, the instability that is currently present in those 2 active regions, and the mathematical reality that an environment capable of producing significant M-class flares is also capable, without a great deal of additional escalation, of producing something considerably worse. The sun does not send a calendar invitation, and there is one more factor in this story that almost nobody mentions, even in the space weather community. Something to do with the time of year, and with a physical phenomenon that makes solar storms hit harder near the equinox, which happens to be exactly when we are. Every year, twice a year, something happens in the relationship between Earth and the sun that makes our planet measurably more vulnerable to space weather. It happens in March and September near the equinoxes, and it is called the Russell-McPherron effect. Here is the mechanism in plain language. Earth's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, is not perfectly aligned with the ecliptic plane, the flat disk of the solar system. It is tilted. Twice a year, near the equinoxes, the geometry between Earth's tilted magnetic field and the direction of the solar wind lines up in a way that allows the solar wind's magnetic field to couple more efficiently with Earth's own field. Think of it like 2 gears. Most of the year, they are slightly offset from each other, so they do not mesh cleanly. Near the equinoxes, they align, and the solar wind's energy transfers into Earth's magnetosphere far more effectively. The result is that geomagnetic storms that occur near the equinox tend to be stronger than the same solar input would produce at other times of year. Not marginally stronger. Measurably, statistically stronger. This is not a fringe theory. It is a documented, peer-reviewed phenomenon that has been observed across decades of space weather data. The Russell-McPherron effect is real. It is well understood in the space weather community, and it is almost never mentioned in any mainstream coverage of space missions. The spring equinox for 2026 fell on March 20th. That was 9 days ago. The window of enhanced vulnerability created by this effect lasts for several weeks on either side of the equinox. We are still inside it. Here's what that means in practical terms. On March 21st and 22nd, 3 weeks ago, Earth experienced a G3 geomagnetic storm. G3 is the third level on a 5-point scale. It was a serious event. The KP index, which measures global geomagnetic disturbance on a scale from 0 to 9, reached approximately 7 during those hours. Auroras were visible at latitudes that do not normally see them. The interplanetary magnetic field was observed in a southward orientation, what scientists call a negative BZ, which is precisely the configuration that allows the solar wind to most efficiently breach Earth's magnetic defenses. None of this is classified. All of it is publicly available in real-time data from the Space Weather Prediction Center, and all of it is happening in the weeks leading up to the first crewed deep space mission in over half a century. To be precise about what the Russell-McPherron effect does and does not mean, it does not increase the probability of a solar flare occurring. The sun does not know what season it is on Earth. What it does is increase the intensity of the geomagnetic impact if a solar event does occur. It is the difference between a storm hitting a coast at low tide versus high tide. The storm is the same. The damage is not. So here is where we are. An active sun with 2 unstable sunspot regions. A prolonged period of elevated space weather. A geomagnetic storm watch issued for the day before launch. And an equinox vulnerability window that amplifies whatever the sun decides to send our way. 4 astronauts preparing to leave the protection of Earth's magnetic field entirely. And yet, as of right now, the mission is a go, which raises a question that is more uncomfortable than it looks. Is that decision based on genuine confidence in the numbers? Or is it based on something else, a quiet assumption that everyone is making, that nobody is quite examining out loud? There is a belief, widely held and almost never examined, that if NASA was genuinely worried about the risks of a given mission, they would say so. They would delay. They would stand in front of cameras and explain that the safety of the crew comes first, and that they will wait for better conditions. NASA has done this before. The Challenger disaster produced a fundamental reckoning with launch pressure and safety culture. The Columbia investigation led to sweeping changes in risk assessment. The agency has a documented, institutional commitment to crew safety that is real and serious and should not be dismissed. But here's the thing about risk in spaceflight. It is never zero. It is managed, calculated, and accepted within defined thresholds. NASA does not operate on certainty. It operates on probability. And the probability framework for radiation risk during Artemis II, from NASA's public-facing perspective, comes out in what looks like a favorable range. The Space Weather Prediction Center currently estimates approximately a 5% probability of even an S1 radiation storm during the mission window. S1 is the lowest level on the solar radiation storm scale. The probability of a more serious event is lower still. 5% sounds reassuring. Here is the problem. In any context involving catastrophic, irreversible outcomes, a crew that cannot be rescued 400,000 kilometers from Earth, facing a radiation event that exceeds their shelter's design limits, 5% is not a small number. It is a number that, if you expressed it in terms of commercial aviation, would ground every airline on the planet. We accept different risk tolerances in spaceflight because the mission is extraordinary, and the people undertaking it are informed volunteers who understand what they are signing up for. But there is a distinction between operational risk, the kind of thing where something goes wrong and you fix it, and catastrophic risk, where something goes wrong and there is nothing to fix. Low probability, high consequence events are the hardest category of risk for human beings to reason about correctly. We are psychologically wired to underestimate them. The research on this is unambiguous. When an event has a 5% probability of occurring, most people's gut instinct treats it as negligibly unlikely. Statistically, though, if you ran that scenario 20 times, you would expect it to occur once. Artemis 2 is not scheduled 20 times. It is scheduled once. The media coverage of this mission has been largely celebratory in tone, which is understandable. The historic firsts are genuine. The engineering achievement is real. The mission represents something meaningful about human ambition and the future of space exploration. None of that is wrong. What is missing from that coverage is a serious engagement with the question of what the acceptable risk threshold actually is, and whether the current solar conditions are being weighed against it with the scrutiny they deserve. Because once those 4 astronauts are on that rocket, and the engines light, and the vehicle clears the tower, the decision is made. There is no pause button. There is no going back to reconsider. And that is where this story gets significantly more complicated. Because the architecture of the mission itself, the elegant, celebrated design of the free return trajectory, contains a feature that is simultaneously its greatest strength and its most overlooked limitation. The free return trajectory sounds like exactly what it is, a path that brings the crew home for free. Once Orion leaves Earth and sets up on this trajectory, the gravitational mechanics of the Earth-Moon system do the work. The spacecraft swings out toward the Moon, uses the Moon's gravity to redirect its path, and arcs back toward Earth without requiring a major engine burn for the return trip. If every system on the spacecraft failed, propulsion, navigation, communication, the laws of orbital mechanics would still, eventually, bring the crew back into Earth's vicinity. It is genuinely elegant. It is a safety feature baked into the physics of the mission. And it is also, in a specific and important sense, a trap. The free return trajectory is elegant precisely because it is fixed. Once the spacecraft commits to that path, once the translunar injection burn is complete and the trajectory is established, there is no rapid return option. You cannot abort and be home in a few hours. You cannot turn around midway and land somewhere. The geometry does not permit it. The spacecraft will take the path the physics dictates, and that path takes several days, 3 to 4 days out to the Moon, several days in the vicinity of the Moon, several days back. The total mission is approximately 10 days. Think of it like a slingshot. The power comes from committing to the motion. Once the stone is released, you cannot grab it back out of the air. Mid-course correction burns are possible, and NASA plans for them. Small adjustments can be made to the trajectory during transit, but these are refinements, not overrides. The crew cannot decide on day 2 that they want to come home immediately and execute a burn that delivers them to Earth in the next 12 hours. The physics of orbital mechanics does not offer that option at this distance. This is not a flaw exactly. It is a design trade-off. The free return trajectory was chosen because it provides a reliable, low-fuel return path in the event of major systems failure. That is a genuine safety benefit, and it matters. But the cost of that benefit is flexibility. And in the context of a solar radiation emergency, flexibility is precisely what you want. Because the thing about a radiation storm is that it does not wait for a convenient moment in the mission timeline. It arrives when the sun decides, which is to say, it arrives without regard for where in the trajectory the crew happens to be. And where they will be for most of this mission is a very long way from anywhere safe. The International Space Station orbits at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. To understand why that matters for radiation protection, you need to understand something about the structure of Earth's magnetic environment. Earth is surrounded by a series of radiation belts, regions of space where charged particles are trapped by the planet's magnetic field. These are called the Van Allen belts. The inner belt begins at roughly 1,000 kilometers altitude and extends to around 12,000 kilometers. The outer belt stretches from roughly 13,000 to 65,000 kilometers. Beyond that boundary, Earth's magnetic protection drops off dramatically. The International Space Station is well inside the inner Van Allen belt's lower boundary. It sits within Earth's magnetosphere, and while it does receive elevated radiation compared to the surface, enough that astronaut career dose limits are a real consideration for long-duration missions, it is protected from the full brunt of solar energetic particle events by the same magnetic field that protects us on the ground. Orion will travel beyond 300,000 kilometers from Earth. That is not a slight difference in degree. It is a categorical difference in kind. Beyond roughly 65,000 kilometers, there is no meaningful magnetic shielding from Earth. The crew will be in direct, unmediated contact with whatever the sun is producing. Every proton, every energetic particle, every wave of radiation that the sun emits will reach them without the filter that 4 billion years of planetary evolution has been quietly providing for every living organism in Earth's history. There is no analogy in human experience for this. Climbing to high altitude increases your radiation exposure measurably. Pilots and flight attendants accumulate higher lifetime doses than ground-based workers for this reason. But even at the altitude of commercial aviation, you are still inside the magnetosphere. Even at the altitude of the space station, you are still inside it. The crew of Artemis 2 will be the first humans in 53 years to be genuinely outside it, for days at a stretch, with nothing between them and the sun except the walls of a spacecraft and their own biological resilience. Communication with the crew from Earth will experience a noticeable delay as the distance increases, not the dramatic minutes-long delays of Mars missions, but enough to complicate real-time emergency decision-making. If a solar event begins to develop, and mission control needs to advise the crew to take shelter, those instructions travel at the speed of light. The storm's radiation, in some scenarios, arrives almost as fast. There is no resupply mission possible. There is no rescue mission conceivable. If something goes wrong 3 days from Earth and 3 days from the Moon, the crew is exactly where they are, with exactly what they have. That reality is not hidden. Every astronaut who signed up for this mission understands it intellectually. But there is a difference between understanding something intellectually and asking whether the current solar conditions warrant a second look at the timing. So, what exactly does Orion offer in terms of protection? And is it enough? Orion is not an Apollo capsule. The radiation protection built into the Orion spacecraft reflects 50 years of research that simply did not exist when NASA was sending people to the Moon in the 1960s and 70s. The comparison is not subtle. It is the difference between a first-generation prototype and a mature engineering system informed by decades of data, analysis, and hard-won operational experience. The spacecraft's structure itself provides passive shielding. The aluminum hull, the thermal protection layers, the interior fittings, all of it attenuates incoming radiation to some degree. This is not accidental. The materials and their placement were chosen with radiation protection in mind, and the cumulative effect across the spacecraft structure is meaningful. More specifically, Orion incorporates a storm shelter concept. If a solar radiation event begins, the crew has a designated refuge within the spacecraft, an area near the heat shield at the densest part of the vehicle's structure, where the material thickness is greatest. This area can be augmented by physically repositioning supplies, food containers, and water bags to add additional mass around the crew. Water is a surprisingly effective radiation shield for energetic protons because of its hydrogen content, and the crew's consumables can serve double duty as protective material in an emergency. The crew will also wear astrorad vests during high-risk periods. These garments are specifically designed to protect critical organs and bone marrow from radiation exposure during solar particle events. They were developed in part through the Artemis 1 mission, which flew a pair of instrumented mannequins nicknamed Helga and Zohar, specifically to measure the radiation environment inside Orion and test the vest's effectiveness. Real-time dosimetry is built into the mission. The crew will have instruments monitoring their accumulated radiation dose throughout the flight, and that data feeds back to mission control continuously. The system is designed so that if dose rates begin to climb, the crew and ground can make informed decisions about shelter duration and activity restrictions. The Artemis 1 flight validated the radiation modeling for Orion across a range of conditions. The models suggested that during a significant solar particle event, a crew in the storm shelter could expect a maximum projected exposure in the range of approximately 150 millisieverts, a dose that is elevated above normal background, but within the range that NASA's career exposure limits are designed to accommodate. Here's the important qualifier hiding in that number. 150 millisieverts represents the projected dose during an expected solar particle event. The modeling is built around events of a certain type and intensity, the kind that occur regularly during solar maximum, the kind that the data from previous solar cycles gives scientists reasonable confidence in modeling accurately. It is not built around every kind of event. It is not built around the extreme end of the solar activity spectrum. And it is specifically not validated against the kind of event that sits at the far tail of the distribution, rare, enormous, and fundamentally different in character from the routine storms the system was designed to handle. The shelter works. The vest works. The dosimetry works. Within the design envelope, Orion's radiation protection system is genuinely impressive. The question is, what happens outside the design envelope? And the answer to that question is more interesting than the official documentation suggests. Orion cannot run. That is the fundamental limitation that all of the impressive engineering cannot engineer around. When a solar particle event begins, when the sun fires a flare and the associated proton storm begins its transit toward Earth, Orion has no option to increase the distance between itself and the radiation. It has no option to retreat to a more shielded location. It has no option to significantly enhance its physical shielding beyond what was installed at the factory. It will be where it is, with what it has, for as long as it takes to get home. The shelter reduces the crew's exposure. It does not eliminate it. The astrorad vest protects critical organs. It does not protect all of them. The dosimeters tell the crew and mission control exactly how much radiation is accumulating. They do not provide any mechanism for stopping that accumulation. There is no historical precedent for testing these systems against an extreme solar particle event with a crew aboard. Artemis 1 flew unmanned. The mannequins measured radiation beautifully, and the data from that mission is genuinely valuable. But mannequins do not get acute radiation syndrome. Mannequins do not have bone marrow that can be disrupted by high-energy proton exposure. The biological response of a living human being to a severe radiation event cannot be fully replicated in a dummy with dosimeters attached. The warning time for a serious solar particle event, in the best-case scenario, is measured in tens of minutes. The fastest protons from a major flare can arrive at Earth's distance in as little as 30 minutes from the time of the flare. The crew would need to identify the threat, receive communication from mission control, and be fully sheltered in a window that, under bad circumstances, is uncomfortably short. And the spacecraft cannot get home faster. If the crew is 3 days from Earth when a major event begins, they will be in transit for those 3 days, regardless of what the sun is doing. The shelter is available for as long as necessary. But a sufficiently prolonged or intense event, the kind that sits at the far end of the solar activity distribution, could deliver cumulative doses that exceed what the shelter was designed to manage. Think of it this way. The storm shelter is a good shelter. It is well built, well thought through, and genuinely protective within its design parameters. But it was designed for storms of a certain size. If the storm is bigger than the shelter was designed for, the shelter is still the best option available. It is just not sufficient. It is protection, not immunity. A shelter from the storm, not a guarantee against it. And there is one more piece of this story that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as radiation risk, a problem that does not exist in deep space at all, but waits for the crew at the very end of their journey, when they are almost home, when the hardest part should be over. When Orion comes home, it will hit the atmosphere at approximately 11 kilometers per second. To put that in terms you can feel, that is roughly 32 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the friction between the spacecraft and the upper atmosphere generates temperatures on the heat shield of around 3,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of some stars. The heat shield is not there to keep the crew comfortable. It is there to keep them alive. The heat shield on Orion uses a material called avcoat, an ablative compound that works by controlled burning. It absorbs the thermal energy of re-entry by slowly charring and flaking away in a precisely managed process, carrying the heat away from the capsule in the process. This is not a new technology. Avcoat was used on Apollo capsules. It is proven, understood, and trusted. Or it was, until Artemis 1 came back. When NASA recovered the Artemis 1 capsule after its December 2022 splashdown and inspected the heat shield, engineers found something they had not expected. The avcoat had eroded in an uneven, asymmetric pattern. Certain areas showed more material loss than the thermal models had predicted. This was not a failure. The capsule was uncrewed, and it landed safely. But it was an anomaly. Something about the re-entry conditions produced behavior in the ablative material that differed from the engineering expectations. NASA investigated. The agency determined that the issue was related to the precise way the boundary layer of hot gas flows over the capsule surface during re-entry at the speeds Orion achieves, speeds that are higher than those experienced by Apollo capsules because Artemis is returning from deeper in the gravitational well. The aerothermal environment is subtly different, and that difference had not been fully captured in the pre-flight models. The fix, as NASA describes it, involves updated flight parameters, specifically managing the angle of re-entry more precisely to control the boundary layer behavior. This is not the same as retesting the heat shield under identical conditions. Artemis 2 will be the first crewed re-entry under these updated parameters. Now, to be clear, NASA's confidence in this approach is not unfounded. The analysis is detailed. The modeling has been updated. The agency's engineering teams are not cavalier about this. But consider the layering here. The crew will launch into an elevated solar environment. They will spend 10 days beyond Earth's magnetic protection during solar maximum with 2 active beta-gamma sunspot regions on the Sun. They will shelter from any radiation events with a system designed for expected rather than extreme scenarios. And then, if they survive all of that, they will re-enter the atmosphere relying on a heat shield whose re-entry behavior produced an unexpected anomaly on its only previous flight. No single one of those elements is a crisis on its own. Together, they represent something that risk analysts call risk stacking. A situation where multiple uncertain factors compound each other in ways that are harder to model than any individual element. The biggest uncertainty, though, is not the spacecraft. The spacecraft was built by engineers with enormous expertise and enormous incentive to get it right. The spacecraft can be tested and validated and revised. The sun cannot. When the sun fires a major flare, the radiation does not wait for a press conference. Electromagnetic radiation, the X-ray and ultraviolet burst from the flare itself, travels at the speed of light and reaches Earth's distance in approximately 8 minutes. There is nothing to be done about that. It arrives when it arrives. For unshielded humans in deep space, this initial burst is concerning but manageable with spacecraft shielding. What comes next is more serious. The most energetic protons associated with a major flare, the particles that pose the greatest biological danger to a crew in deep space, can follow the electromagnetic burst within approximately 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the event's energy spectrum and the configuration of the interplanetary magnetic field at the time. In the best observed cases of extreme events, the first high-energy particles have arrived at Earth's distance in as little as 30 minutes from flare onset. 30 minutes. That is the outer edge of the warning window. On one end, the flare occurs, and instruments on spacecraft and ground-based observatories detect it. Scientists at the Space Weather Prediction Center analyze the data. An alert is issued. The alert is transmitted to the spacecraft. With communication time factored in, and the processing delay between detection and alert, the crew might have 20 to 30 minutes of effective warning before the most energetic particles arrive. On a good day, with a well-characterized event, with no communication hiccups. On a less good day, the window is tighter. Some events are impulsive. They accelerate particles faster and with less precursor activity than average. Some events occur in geometries where the magnetic field configuration channels particles toward Earth more efficiently. The August 1972 event was remarkable, partly because of how rapidly and intensely it developed. 20 minutes to recognize the danger, communicate across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of space, decide on the appropriate response, and have 4 astronauts fully positioned in their radiation shelter is achievable. Probably. Under good conditions, with alert crew and clear communication. What it is not is comfortable. And here's the part of the warning timeline that tends to get glossed over. The decision about whether to shelter is not always obvious in real time. A flare begins. Is it an M-class event that will peak and fade without a significant proton component? Or is it the beginning of an escalating sequence that will produce a dangerous particle storm? In the minutes immediately following a flare, that distinction is not always clear. Forecasters are making probabilistic judgments with incomplete information. The crew is being asked to make a significant decision, one that involves stopping whatever they are doing, repositioning inside the spacecraft, and potentially waiting in a confined shelter for hours or days, based on an early-stage assessment of an inherently unpredictable system. The August 1972 event, had it occurred during a transit, would not have given the crew of that era any meaningful warning at all. The technology barely existed to detect it in real time. We are better now. Much better. But the sun is also, right now, showing signs of wanting to do something more dramatic than the M-class events we have seen in the past week. And the difference between an M-class flare and an X-class flare is not just a letter. The solar flare classification system uses letters to represent different energy levels: B, C, M, and X, with each step representing a roughly 10-fold increase in X-ray output. An M-class flare is 10 times more energetic than a C-class flare. An X-class flare is 10 times more energetic than an M-class flare, and 100 times more energetic than the background C-class activity that has been routine over the past several days. But the classification system, useful as it is, obscures something important about how solar activity actually unfolds. Major solar events rarely come out of nowhere. They come from regions that have been building in complexity and magnetic tension over days or weeks. The active regions that produce X-class flares are almost always the same regions that have already been producing C-class and M-class activity. The smaller flares are not just random noise, they are evidence of the unstable magnetic configuration that makes the big events possible. In a sense, every M-class flare from a beta-gamma region is the sun showing you the loaded spring. The M-class events are practice shots. The X-class event is when the spring releases. Active regions 4401 and 4405 are currently in the category of regions that produce M-class flares. They are not currently producing X-class flares, but both of them have the magnetic configuration that makes X-class production possible. Both of them have been demonstrating the kind of ongoing, restless activity that space weather forecasters specifically watch as a precursor signature. The 10% probability that the Space Weather Prediction Center assigns to X-class flare activity in the current forecast period is a probabilistic snapshot of a dynamic, evolving system. As the active regions rotate across the solar disk and their magnetic configurations continue to develop, that number moves. It can move down if the regions begin to simplify and settle. It can move up, sometimes rapidly, if the magnetic complexity increases or if the regions begin showing more impulsive behavior. Active regions do not announce their intentions. Some regions that look threatening never produce a significant event. Some regions that look relatively calm produce the biggest storms on record. The beta-gamma classification tells you the instability is there. It does not tell you when or whether the instability will resolve explosively. The specific, uncomfortable truth about the current situation is this: the sun is not currently in a dangerous configuration for the Artemis II crew. It is currently in a configuration that is consistent with producing a dangerous situation. Those are different statements, and the difference matters enormously. The first statement would mean everything is fine. The second statement means the risk is real, present, and quantifiable, just not yet realized. One of these sounds better in a press release. Neither one is wrong, but only one of them accurately describes what you are dealing with when you are planning to send 4 people into deep space for 10 days. So, what is the actual probability of the worst-case scenario? And here is where the mathematics gets genuinely uncomfortable. When Solar Cycle 25 began, the scientific consensus was cautiously optimistic about its relative mildness. Official forecasting panels, groups of solar physicists who pool their predictive models to produce consensus estimates of solar cycle intensity, initially projected that Cycle 25 would be a below-average to average cycle. Not a repeat of Solar Cycle 24, which was the weakest cycle in a century, but not a particularly robust or threatening one either. The predicted sunspot maximum was modest. The expected peak in flare activity was within normal historical ranges. The sun did not read the forecast. By 2023, it was already clear that Cycle 25 was outperforming expectations. Sunspot counts were running significantly above the consensus prediction. Flare frequency was elevated. The cycle was reaching toward its maximum faster and with more intensity than the models had suggested. By 2024, official forecasts were being revised upward, a tacit acknowledgement that the predictive models had missed something significant about this cycle's behavior. As of early 2026, Solar Cycle 25 has produced more activity than predicted, has sustained that elevated activity longer than predicted, and appears to be spending more time near its maximum than a typical cycle would. Whether this represents a true extended maximum or a broader, flatter peak is something that will only be clear in retrospect, when the cycle begins its decline. What it means right now is that the risk models for radiation exposure during Artemis II are based on historical data and cycle predictions that have, in at least some meaningful respects, underestimated the sun's current behavior. The models are the best available tools. They are informed by decades of data and the work of some of the most capable scientists in this field. And they are also tools that were calibrated against a forecast that the sun has already exceeded. This is not a condemnation of solar science. Predicting the sun is genuinely difficult. The dynamics of the solar interior that drive the 11-year cycle involve magnetohydrodynamic processes at scales and temperatures that cannot be directly observed or fully simulated. The scientific community is transparent about the uncertainties in solar cycle prediction, and the revision of Cycle 25 forecasts upward has been handled openly and professionally. But uncertainty in risk modeling does not distribute symmetrically. When a model has already proven to underestimate in one direction, when the sun has already been more active than predicted, the intellectually honest response is to widen the uncertainty bounds toward the high end of the range. Not dramatically, not into speculation or panic, but with honest acknowledgement that the model's track record in this cycle suggests the actual risk may be slightly higher than the models indicate. We may be underestimating this solar cycle's peak behavior. We may be underestimating it in exactly the window of time that Artemis II is launching into. So why, given everything, the active regions, the equinox vulnerability, the overperforming cycle, the history of 1972, is the mission proceeding on schedule? What does NASA's actual decision-making framework look like from the inside? And is the rational case for going as strong as the official position suggests? To understand why NASA is proceeding with Artemis II on the current timeline, you have to start with what the data actually shows, not what it might become. Right now, today, the proton flux in the space environment is low, not marginally low, genuinely within the baseline range that characterizes safe operating conditions. There is no Earth-directed coronal mass ejection currently in transit. There is no elevated proton event in progress. The active regions are producing flares, yes, but they are producing them without the proton component that would constitute a radiation hazard to the crew. The Space Weather Prediction Center's operational forecast for radiation storm probability sits at approximately 5% for even low-level events. NASA's own modeling, informed by that forecast and by the mission's specific trajectory and timeline, would produce an integrated risk number that is low by the standards of human spaceflight risk tolerance. Orion's systems were tested on Artemis I. The radiation models validated against that mission's real-world data. The storm shelter has been designed and refined. The crew has been trained for solar event protocols. Backup launch windows exist. If conditions deteriorate significantly before launch, the mission can be delayed without enormous programmatic consequences. NASA's institutional culture, post-Challenger and post-Columbia, includes a genuine, embedded commitment to safety that is not merely aspirational. The agency has standing protocols for real-time space weather monitoring during launch and transit. If conditions change materially before or during the mission, mission planners have decision frameworks for responding to that change. The career exposure limits for the Artemis II crew are set conservatively. Even under the projected conditions of a significant but non-extreme solar particle event, the expected cumulative dose to a sheltered crew falls within the career limits that NASA has established based on extensive review of the radiation health literature. By the metrics that NASA uses to make go or no-go decisions, Artemis II is within acceptable parameters. That is not spin. That is a genuine representation of the agency's position as understood through its public documentation and the current observable data. The rational case for proceeding is real, and it is supported by credible evidence and serious analysis. The question is whether those metrics are the right metrics, and whether the history of this solar cycle, the anomalies in the heat shield data, and the fundamental unpredictability of solar maximum conditions suggest that the acceptable parameters may need to be looked at differently. 53 years have passed since humans last traveled beyond low Earth orbit. That sentence contains a fact that tends to get treated as merely historical, a gap in the timeline, a pause between chapters. But it also contains an operational reality that rarely gets stated plainly. In 53 years of technological development, advancement in space weather forecasting, refinement of radiation modeling, and improvement of spacecraft design, we have not produced a single empirical data point on how a living human crew performs during a significant solar particle event beyond Earth's magnetosphere. We have models. We have the Artemis 1 mannequin data. We have decades of research into radiation biology, proton effects on human tissue, and long-duration dose accumulation. All of this is valuable. None of it is the same as a crew having actually been through it. The nearest historical analog is the period from 1968 to 1972, when 12 humans walked on the moon across 6 missions. None of those crews encountered a major solar particle event in transit. The August 1972 event, as we have established, occurred between missions. The closest thing to a real-world test of human deep space radiation exposure during solar activity is a dataset of 6 missions that all happened to miss the bullet. The fact that we have no empirical record of a crew experiencing a dangerous solar event beyond the magnetosphere is not evidence that such events cannot occur during crewed missions. It is evidence that the sample size is small and the luck has, so far, held. Artemis 2 is being described as a return to deep space after a 53-year absence. What it is, more precisely, is the first genuine opportunity to collect real-world data on how well our planning holds up against conditions we have only ever modeled. That is not nothing. That is actually a significant source of uncertainty that the current risk framework has no entirely satisfying way to account for. The July 1969 to December 1972 window produced beautiful data about what happens when everything goes right. We have essentially no modern data about what happens when the sun decides to be the sun. And there are people who believe that the timing of this mission, the specific placement of the launch window, is not determined entirely by the mathematics of solar activity. Picture this. Day 4 of the Artemis 2 mission. The crew is approximately 250,000 kilometers from Earth. They are past the moon. They are further from the planet's surface than any human being has been since December of 1972. The communication delay with mission control is around 1.5 seconds each way. Outside the spacecraft walls, there is nothing. No atmosphere, no magnetic field, no gravity worth mentioning. Just the interplanetary medium and the sun. At 1400 hours mission time, the space weather instruments aboard the spacecraft register a sudden, sharp increase in X-ray flux. Active region 4401, or its equivalent in the actual mission timeline, whichever region happens to be facing Earth at that moment, has produced a significant flare. Within 2 minutes, the Space Weather Prediction Center detects the event and begins analysis. Within 5 minutes, an alert is transmitted toward the spacecraft. It arrives 7 seconds later. The question before the crew is simple and not simple at all. Is this the beginning of a proton storm, or is it a flare that will produce no significant particle component? They have experienced this decision point in simulation. They know the protocol. They have approximately 20 minutes, possibly less, before the answer becomes irrelevant because the particles will already be arriving. They move to the shelter. They wait. And this is the moment, this specific, concrete, human moment, that all of the trajectory math and probability estimates and engineering documentation and press releases eventually resolve into. 4 people in a spacecraft the size of a large SUV, hundreds of thousands of kilometers from the nearest other human being, listening to the dosimeters, watching the numbers, and waiting to see if the sun decides to stop. The Artemis 1 mission flew that same trajectory in that same spacecraft, without a crew. The mannequins measured the radiation beautifully. they accumulated dose data across the full mission profile. They came home, and the engineers extracted the dosimeters and built better models. The mannequins never had to make a decision. 4 months after the August 1972 solar particle event, Gene Cernan descended the ladder of the Apollo 17 lunar module and became the last human being to walk on the surface of the moon. He and his crew had no idea how close the program had come 4 months earlier to a catastrophe that would likely have ended human space exploration for a generation. The timing had been lucky. The mission had been brilliant. Those two things existed together, and the luck was not in the history books. Now, we are going back. For the first time in 53 years, 4 human beings will travel beyond the protective reach of Earth's magnetic field, during a solar maximum that has already exceeded its predicted intensity. With 2 active and unstable sunspot regions on the solar disk, in a window of equinox vulnerability that amplifies any storm that arrives, carrying a crew that represents multiple historic firsts that the world has been waiting for. The engineering is better than it was in 1972. The monitoring is better. The spacecraft is better. The forecasting is better. Every single element of the mission's preparation is better than what existed the last time we did this. And yet, the sun is the same sun. It does not have a vested interest in the mission succeeding. It does not consult the launch schedule. It does not care about the historic milestones, or the budget pressures, or the geopolitical competition, or the cameras pointed at the sky at Kennedy Space Center. It is doing what it has always done, cycling through periods of activity and calm, building magnetic tension and releasing it explosively, in patterns that we understand well enough to forecast and not well enough to predict with certainty. We have spent 53 years preparing to go back to the moon. We have built a spacecraft specifically designed to survive deep space. We have trained 4 extraordinary people to operate it. We have done, by any reasonable assessment, everything that human ingenuity and institutional commitment could do to prepare for this mission. What we have not done, what we genuinely cannot do, is test what happens when the preparation meets a solar event that sits outside the design envelope. We have never been in deep space during a bad day on the sun. We have models of what would happen. We have plans for what to do. We have shelters and vests and dosimeters and protocols. But we have never actually been there. And that fact, that single, irreducible, honest fact, is the one that sits beneath all the countdown clocks and the historic milestone coverage and the engineering achievement narratives. Patient and quiet, waiting. We have spent 53 years preparing to go back, but we have never tested what happens if the timing is wrong again.